Hello and welcome back to my channel. To today's video I got a guest, which is Cysion, also known as Bert Beeckman, who is the lead designer and project leader of Forgotten Empires. And yeah, I got a little catalog of questions regarding the development of Age of Empires 1 Definitive Edition and its future, what this all means, and yeah, that kind of stuff. And yeah, I will just start right off the bat with the first question, which is, how did this all start? So since the release of Age of Empires 2 HD, people said, hey, maybe do we work of Age of Empires 1, and Note came, and yeah, just talk something about this.
Right, so after Age of Empires 2 got re-released as an HD edition, we also saw Age of Empires 3 appearing on Steam. That did not get any changes though. But then there was also Age of Empires 1, which was the only one in the series that was very, very hard to come by. You could still find some copies on Amazon and eBay, but even then it was quite tricky to get it working. On Windows 10. I remember quite struggling to get my old city running again. So yeah, that kind of made it a simple decision, I would say, for Microsoft. I mean, by now we learned that they're working on Age of Empires 4, and what better way to kind of, how should I say it, prepare the world for Age of Empires 4 than revisiting the old titles and giving them a refresher. And that's basically the reason we got these Age of Empires 1, 2, and 3 DEs that have been announced as well. And yeah, for Age of Empires 1, it was the first in a row, so start there. And it's the one that actually needed the most work. Let's be honest about that one. It hasn't seen any development in what, 20 years nearly. So yeah, that's quite a bit of time to catch up. Not just how should I say it? Not just because it's been a long time, but because the industry has been moving quite fast, and also strategy games have been evolving. And then you have H1, which has been standing still in time for 20 years. So there's quite a bit of changes that you can potentially make to that.
Yeah, and talking about those changes, well, there were quite a lot of them, as you already said. But with which philosophy did you approach the changes? So between keeping it original, keeping it the way people remember the game, versus adding new features, how was your approach to achieve that feel of the game? And yeah, so those things.
So it's a very, very hard balance to strike. On one hand, you know that you can change a lot, and that a lot of the mechanisms feel a bit clunky nowadays. But on the other hand, you have a big community of people who have very fond memories of the very original game, and also on how the original game was played, and also a lot of people who still play the game nowadays. There's this massive community in Vietnam of competitive players. They even have tournaments of Age of Empires 1 on live TV. Like, you can go to a bar and watch Age of Empires 1. And I mean, that's a big community that you also have to keep in mind, right? So a very good example, the farm change that we did. In DE, in Definitive Edition, you can walk over farms. If you have soldiers walking up to your farms, they can now cross it. In the original games, they would just stop as if there was a concrete wall. That's a change that I would say 99% of definitely casual players absolutely loved. Like, it makes sense. It's a great quality of life change. But Vietnamese community, they don't really like it, because for all these years they've been used to using those farms as walls to protect their economy, and that's completely changed their game style. And we got messages like, hey, we don't really fancy this change, or can you revert this? So even with changes that 99% of the people like, you can still upset other people. that has always been the biggest difficulty. Like where do we draw that line in the sand to say this needs to change and this needs to stay? And on one hand, on a lot of things, I think we kind of hit the nail on the head. Like, for example, now you can set your own hotkeys. The original one did not allow you to do that. There were hotkeys, but they were all preset. So unless you had giant's hands and a very good memory, you could not really use them. I could not use them for sure. But now you can customize them. That's like a no-brainer change. Like everybody likes to set hotkeys, right? But on the other hand, like the farm change I mentioned, we made the decision not to add gates. That is a very controversial decision. We said, like, if you add gates, you really change the game quite a bit. And a lot of people kind of expected it. They said, like, H2 has gates, why doesn't H1 have gates? And yeah, it would just change the game massively. One of the things that we consider really part of H1 is that it's a very unforgiving kind of gameplay. Like you have your economy, and then all of a sudden there's, I don't know, a hoplite in your economy, and your economy just dies unless you run away. And if you have gates and garrison mechanics and all that stuff, you have a completely different game, and it would not be unforgiving anymore at all. And that we really wanted to keep. So there we go.
Okay, and then so there were also quite a few balance changes made with the definitive edition. And so first of all, how was your impression of the original game balance, and why were those changes made? And then also connected to that, was the focus of the balance changes more on pro players or more on the casual player base?
So any balance change that is ever made, if it's made to H2 or H1, it's always focused on the pro players. So we sat together with whatever is left of the competitive scene here on this side of the globe, and we kind of sat together and said, like, hey, what do you guys want to see changed? We had a big list ready, with suggested changes, and we went through that list with them, and they also made suggestions, like additions, like changes, etc. And with that, we kind of went to the game, we tested a bit, and then we put them into the game. But every change we make is always for the pro players. However, we also want to make sure that whatever change we make does not make the game less fun for casual players. I think a perfect example of this is something we did in the past for H2. We changed the Mangudai. So at one point we changed the Mangudai siege bonus, and we removed it and we limited it to only rams. That was balance-wise good, because all of a sudden Mangudais had a counter, at least one counter, and but a lot of casual players, and actually also good players, just didn't like that bonus disappeared. I was like, yeah, but that was a whole fun bit of Mangudai, and now it's gone. So what do you do there? So we had to find a different solution, which we then did. Now they have their siege bonus back, slightly different, but they have it back. And yeah, those are the things that's kind of how we make sure that also that it is for pro players, but that casual players still have the fun bits of the bonuses. That's really the philosophy to look at it. Now, balance in the original game was really outrageous, I would say. It was all over the place. You could have a catapult, he would shoot one projectile into your army, and the whole army would be flattened. And that's very extreme. But on the other hand, that's also kind of part of Age of Empires 1. It's very ruthless, it's very unforgiving. If you don't pay attention for a second, you can lose your entire army, just like that. So, in a way, we also wanted to keep that, but we also wanted to polish it a tiny bit. And I think the best examples are like the super extreme bonuses that are in the game. I think best example there is the Hittites. They had a bonus where their catapults would have twice the amount of hit points. So instead of 150 hit points on your catapult, you had all of a sudden 300. And that's just insane. It just made them completely overpowered. So we had to change. We had to change that. We made it like 50% rather than 100% better. So we still have the fun bit, like your catapults are enormously strong, but it's not ridiculous anymore. So that's kind of the level of changes that we did.
Good. And now to a little bit, uncomfortable question, maybe. So the reviews by gaming magazines and websites, they were fairly positive when the game released. So talking about Definitive Edition 1, of course. But there was quite somewhat of a backlash in the community. The ratings on the Microsoft Store, they were astonishingly low. People were having all sorts of complaints about the games. I've just checked this again, and the user ratings actually have risen quite a good amount. That it roughly mirrors the quote unquote professional reviews. But why do you think this was there in the first place? So do you think that people had maybe unrealistic expectations, or do you maybe see the fault more on your side, if the communication to the fans was lackluster? Was this what this game actually was meant to be, what it will deliver, what it won't deliver? That would be the question here.
I think we can split it up in two questions, actually, because I'll first address the reviews. So indeed, the professional reviews were actually as we expected. They were fine. They were not outrageous or like, wow, this game is the best thing ever, like game of the year. It was not that kind of level, but we were happy with what professional reviewers had to say. And I think the criticism they had was largely fair. However, the store rating, and that's very important to us as well. We had a lot of issues around launch with crashes, and roughly, I would say 90% of our negative reviews was from people who had crashing issues. These crashing issues were, how should I say, a bit unexpected. Like we had a long beta where we tested things, and we also had crash logs from people who played during the beta. Then you can also have an idea of like, hey, which crashes are frequent, which ones are not. But the level of, or should I say, the amount of crashes that we saw during launch, we definitely did not see that coming. That was an issue that kind of took us blindsided. So we went in there. We tried to reach out to as many people as possible. But of course, if you've just bought a game, you paid, I don't know, €20 for it, and it crashes, the first thing you do is you go to the store and you leave a 1-star review, and that's very fair. But that is indeed the main reason that the reviews were not that great at the beginning. Like literally 90% of our bad reviews were because people had issues launching the game. Now, I'm very happy to say that all of those are now resolved. We barely see crashes or desyncs in our logs. So that is absolutely good news. And we also see that in the store ratings, like the store that Microsoft looks at the most is the US store rating. And that went from 2 point something, which is very low, out of 5 stars. Let's say 2 out of 5 stars to 4.2 stars. So that's 84% rating. That's good. That's good. And that's very glad that we've seen that turn around. So after all the crashes were gone, we now see like, okay, people actually like the game. People like what we've done to it. Now, to your second, like how I see it as a separate question is the expectations of people. Because indeed, the reviewers also said like, this is the original Age of Empires 1 game, and it still has that very old school feel to it. And a lot of people indeed play the game and they were like, hey, this is not Age of Empires 2, this is Age of Empires 1. And, or let's say this is not Age of Empires 2, period, because maybe they didn't play Age of Empires 1, and then they go back to Age of Empires 1 and they're like, wait, this is not as good, or this is weirder, or this is different, or yeah, it's not what they completely expected. And I think that's fair. Like between Age of Empires 1 and Age of Empires 2, there were a few years of development time, and we could not just simply like copy paste between the games. One of the big things that people, for example, wondered about was like, hey, the AI. The AI in Age of Empires 2 by now is quite good, I would say, in HD at least. In the original game, the AI is still a bit funny, but in HD, it's quite good. But the AI in HD, compared to the AI in H1, there's a difference of development time of roughly 5 years. And you can't just copy paste it. You can't just copy paste the code. So then you're like, okay, we can make improvements, we can make changes, but we can't just bridge the gap of 5 years of improvements. That was just not feasible. So in a way, we definitely try to reach out to magazines and websites and doing interviews as much as possible to kind of say like, hey, this is what we're making. We're really paying tribute to the very first original H1, but it's not an H2. And yeah, of course, you can't reach everybody. So people still have expectations, and that's fine, and that's normal. But in the end, our goal was to make an H1. It was not to make an H2 reskin, because that would definitely upset the people who have been so loyal to H1 since the start. So that comes back to the very first question we had, like, where do you put the line in the sand? Where that's a tricky balance of renewing and keeping the old one. So yeah.
Okay. Then talk about this. What is the future? What are your plans for the future of the definitive edition? So are there any more balance changes on the horizon? Actually, I'm not sure if balance changes in this case would actually be required, because there was a long testing phase, but will there be more backfix updates, more performance? You talked about improving the AI. Is there anything in this direction planned, or maybe even content updates, since the ratings, they seem fine now? So maybe a DLC, Sieves Northern of the Alps, the Celts, Gauls, and such things. Would you think this could happen? I'm sure how much you can actually talk about this, but just say.
I can't talk about. I can't give details on any of that. I would say yeah, it's possible. Such an expansion also would fit perfectly, but I'm really not saying it's going to happen. I just can't answer for that. Now on patching plans, so we still have patches coming out. Currently we are at patch 6, I believe, and the next one will be, well, patch 7, logically. And our main focus on those patches, especially given what I said earlier, was like addressing crashes. We believe we have now almost all of those crashes. Actually, there's one more crash fix coming in the next patch, now that I think about it. So that's been our main focus so far. We also added one new feature in those patches, which was a very basic spectator mode. It's not very elaborate. It's the same system as H2 HD. So you have to join in advance, take up a player slot, and then you can spectate the game. So it's very, very simple spectator mode, but yeah, it's there basically to give people something in such short time frame. And other than that, bug fixes. We have quite a big backlog of bugs that we have identified and that we would love to see addressed as well. As far as more planned features, we have a long list of things that we want to do, but it's a matter of time if we actually can do them, if we're allowed to do them, etc. So I can't say that much, but yeah, the reality is we have a lot of things that we would love to do, but yeah, we will see. We're not the only ones in the equation.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, and now on to the last and the final question. So now that some time has passed since the release of the game, what did you take away from the development of Age of Empires 1DE? What did you learn from it, and will this in any way change the way you will approach the next release, which is Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition?
I think for Age of Empires 2 it will be a bit easier in the way that Age of Empires 2 is already a very polished game and a very beloved game by literally millions of people. For many people, H2 was the first one they played, and not necessarily H1. And if you have people going back from H2 to H1, they're like, wait, what? What is this? And if they just play H2, it's like, okay, this is a good game. So the changes that we want to make are not necessarily as deep. We definitely don't want to go in and change gameplay, for example. In H1, we could still do things like the walkable forms or gather points or the ability to queue units, to multi-select buildings, things like that. We don't need to do this in H2 because it already has all those things. There are like a few quality of life improvements that are still possible, but they would not fundamentally change the gameplay. So we're actually in a much better, easier state in H2 already to make further changes, because that in the end was the big trickiness with H1. Like, what you change, how much can you change? And in H2 we also already have a few years of experience with adding new things, changing up features, but the expansions have been very well received, so we kind of know like how far can we go with changes. So if I look at the features that we had since the expansions, like better AI or more features, more objects in the scenario editor, stuff like that. Those are things that nobody is against that, right? Everybody sees like, okay, the AI is more fun to play with, or I have more objects in the scenario editor to put in my scenarios, and people are like, yeah, that's good. Like, you can't be really against that. Let's put it like that. So we have a good idea already on what we want to do and what we can do with H2DE.
Okay, well, that sounds good. We've reached the end of that interview, so I would like to thank you for being here, and
yeah, thanks for having me.
Good. Goodbye.
All right. Yep. Bye-bye. Ciao.